I always wanted to be an architect since I was about 7 years old. I feel like a lot of my friends back then didn't even know what an architect was, and somehow I did. I had my sister who actually went to architecture school and practiced for a little bit, then went on different routes. But I grew up watching her draw really beautiful buildings in the middle of the night, actually. And I used to dream about doing the same since I was very little, which is very odd. And also my dad was always involved with construction. He had some excavator trucks, and he would like take me to construction sites and put me on top of an excavator truck, and I would drive. I look back at it now, and I'm like, wow, that was very dangerous. I can't believe he did that. I would never do that to my son now.
But a formative education.
Yeah, sure. Very hands-on. I was excavating construction sites at 8.
So you have like 30 years of construction experience.
Yeah, I guess so. Lots of experience. I usually say 10 years, but I should emphasize the length back then. But also, my dad built our house, in very incremental portions throughout most of my life. So I was always surrounded by built parts of the house. And would always get surprised by a new addition, there would be like a new service area, added to our house, or like a second story that was unfinished, but, there would be like a door to nowhere. And you could, it was always a bit dangerous to like navigate our house, that added to the thrill of being there. But I always dreamt of one day renovating the house because I had my reservations about my dad's design, ideas. He did invite me to design some portions of it. And I also look back and I'm like, why did he let me design that wall tile? like it's so bad. But he just always wanted me to be a part of that process, even mixing concrete, building our doghouse.
And you're still practicing today as an architect, right?
Yes, I am. And I did do there was a moment where I was questioning being in architecture in the more, traditional sense. Back in 2008, I got laid off, actually twice, 2008, 2007. When I was in Miami because of the recession. So at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm never going to work for somebody again. I'm just going to freelance and try and do my own thing. And I did that for some time. And I also started volunteering with Architecture for Humanity. And then saw that there was an interest in the architecture community in Miami for volunteer opportunities and, being of service and, engaging with communities that usually get overlooked by our profession. So I started the Miami chapter, a local chapter of Architecture for Humanity. And our group grew, from just me to like a few hundred members.
That's fantastic. So Andrew, how did it all kick off for you?
Apparently, when I was 3, I told my mom kind of similar, like that I was going to build buildings. I'm not really sure how or why I knew that. But apparently it's always been something for me. And my mom was a studio art major. So it was always kind of like creative endeavors around the house. My dad is not, duct tape is his friend for any kind of, if he goes after a household thing at all, it's that. So
that's a good description.
But yeah, no, I've always been kind of interested in these things, and went to UVA for my undergrad. Similarly, kind of engaged in some really interesting community engagement and design build projects that I think really allowed me to understand what the profession could be beyond potentially designing for 2% of people that we commonly see, right? And then I went to Rice for my graduate degree. Again, worked on some community engagement projects there. Wound up teaching at Michigan for a couple of years, kind of happenstance, but there I was, right place, right time. And had worked at a prefab home company there, so learned a lot of really interesting skills related to that, and kind of built on some skills that I had learned in Houston. And so with all of that kind of combined, as we were moving back to New York, SHOP was kind of the perfect place to be in a lot of ways. It was growing. It was after Barclays. They were hiring like crazy, a lot of really interesting people. And so I wound up working there for 7 years and had a really great experience. And, we got to work together on a number of projects and really ran the gamut, like never got pigeonholed into anything. But, 7 years at any place, 7 years in architecture, 7 years in New York, it's like those things compound really quickly. And I kind of realized that I had never, and that I was kind of gotten away from this idea of community engagement. And in that time, the organizer that Jay and I had been working with reached out to us or reached out to me, I should say, and asked if I'd be interested in coming on full time with the union as an organizer. And after, I was skeptical, of course, like anything, right?
Sure.
But after a couple of conversations, it became clear that it felt like an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And so I've been a full-time union organizer for about 6 months, only working with architects. And, we'll probably talk about this a little bit, but with a number of groups, and it's really exciting in that way.
So how did the two of you, so you both met at SHOP, it sounds like perhaps, but how did the two of you end up getting involved with AWU? How was it founded? How did it come around?
Basically, there was no WU when we started conversations about organizing at SHOP. But really in the summer of 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd assassination, we were having a lot of discussions at the office related about, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and not only at SHOP, but also in the field. And we wanted to figure out a way to have more of a direct engagement with those issues as they sort of manifested within the office. And because we were kind of told not to have these conversations on the platform from the office, we were having side conversations, and those side conversations became solidified in with a more concrete goal when layoffs happened right after the summer in the fall of 2020. A few of us kind of who stuck around, who made it through the layoffs, were feeling extra insecure about our jobs and our job stability.
Sure.
So we started, we had discussions throughout the summer about, what we could do to improve things in the office and beyond. And then at some point we just were kind of hitting a wall, and we just started talking about, what does it mean to organize a union here at SHOP, and how do we make it inclusive so that it's something that becomes an umbrella, or we set the path for other, firms or workers who are interested in doing the same. So we basically, it started off by just coming up with a logo and a name for our own union. And then we realized, this is be big enough that we can just attach our name or, SHOP to the side. And if it's let's say any other firm, they could just swap that part.
Yeah. So
basically the logo.
Of course.
That's the origin.
You always start with the logo.
Shocking.
For designers to start with the logo.
How do we want ourselves to look like?
That's it. So this all kind of kicked off December of 2020, and my memory is so bad now that COVID was already happening, right? So COVID happened. Right. So the just to be a little more specific, the kinds of conversations that were happening in the office, can you talk about that a little bit? I presume it was all the same conversations we used to have and continue to have about over hours, underpay, and this is not. I'm not talking about SHOP specifically. I'm talking about
the industry in general,
industry wide, and other industries as well. Overtime, underpay, sometimes toxic work environments and people that should not be project leaders. Was this the kind of thing? Maybe.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think one of the and Jade has talked about this. I've heard her talk about this a lot with people, that these equity and diversity and justice and inclusion conversations that were happening in 2020, and they were happening at every company and every industry at some level, right? We we sort of quickly started transitioning to, okay, those are all really important, and we want to think about our business practices so that we're making them more equitable and making them more inclusionary. But what kind of environment, and again, not shop, but like what kind of profession are we encouraging these people to join, right? And be a part of? Is it just, and is it equitable once they get into it, right? And I think, to your point, like all of these issues of unpaid, uncompensated time, and toxic work environments, and toxic academic environments, and other things of that nature, right? Like it quickly was like, this is much bigger. These are all systemic issues that we're talking about, and I think so much of the idea around organizing and unionization is really about sharing your ideas with people and sharing your issues, like, so you can kind of say, is it just me? Am I the only person that's really thinking about this? Oh, I'm not the only person that's thinking about this. Okay, I'm not crazy. And oh, wow, 20 people have the same thought that I do, right? Or like some slight variation of it. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation. And, I think with the branding exercise, we did a lot of names, a lot of logos, as you might imagine. And it was really important to us to think about the name of it that could do two things. One was, to Jay's point, that like other people could tap into it really quickly as they wanted to, but also in kind of recognition of the fact that, architectural workers that are not licensed cannot call themselves architects, right? So many of the names were like architects this and architects that. And it was like, well, but most of us that are most precarious actually aren't architects and can't call ourselves that legally. And on top of that, it was like, well, why is this any different for landscape architects or for planners or for interior designers or lighting designers or really anybody working on the built environment? So it was like, all right, let's make this an inclusive kind of moniker that people can tap into.
And that's how you guys ended up with the term architectural?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's also at least the word worker is something that the architecture lobby always sort of advocates for us to start, understanding that we're workers. If you're not an owner of a firm, you're an architectural worker. Even if you're not licensed or you are licensed, it doesn't matter. You're still a worker. And so the word worker is one of the most important parts of the AWU name, just because then it starts allowing us to create an alliance with other workers, not only within the architecture industry, but throughout, the whole labor pool, if you will. So we're workers in architecture, but we're also part of a larger sort of labor movement. This isn't happening in isolation. We're not doing anything that's completely new. Yes, it is new for architects, but it's not new in the grand scheme of things, And so for any questions, any doubts, any fears, we never have to think up solutions from our own imagination. We just have to tap into an existing historical, pool of knowledge.
There's precedent.
There's precedent, and we don't need to be acting alone. And there's a lot of proven steps, that we can take to just allow ourselves to gain the rights that we as workers have the right to.
It's something that we've never really understood, why there is or there wasn't any union in the field of architecture, when there is union in the field of construction, there is union in the movie industry, there is union throughout a bunch of other industries, right? And it's something that I still don't get. Is it because, I don't know, is it because maybe unions have a reputation that they're going to cause problems or friction, and therefore, let's just try and avoid their existence? Is that the reason?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of layers to this, unfortunately. I mean, I think the entertainment industry as an example, the construction industry as an example, and more recently, like tech and sort of digital media, that, there was no digital media company that was unionized until 7 years ago. And now it's fully industry standard, right? And tech in general is kind of moving in this direction. It's certainly not moving as quickly, but you have Kickstarter, you have Google subcontractors, you have other things. I think with Architect, there's a couple of things sort of working against us in a way. One is, in most cases, even with bigger companies, you're kind of sitting on the floor with your boss, right? Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, you really know them very well, and you know them in a way where, like, you get drinks with them, or you have lunch with them, or you have meals, or you know their kids, or whatever it might be. And that sort of really close relationship, you all of a sudden say, well, I can't like go against them in that way. That doesn't make sense, regardless of what the conditions really are. And I think a lot of that then goes to the second point, which is that I think there's a lot, like, we as workers and as unions sort of lost a PR battle over the last 50 years, right? That started in a lot of ways in the 50s with McCarthyism, continued with some legislation, and I think really peaked with Reagan taking office and busting up a strike of air traffic controllers, and basically asserting that, like, workers don't have these rights and they shouldn't have these rights. And if we allow companies to do what they're good at, then everyone will benefit. And so with that, you saw a huge downgrowth in union activity, in union membership, in everything related to unions, while at the same time, again, correlation is not causation, but
sure.
While the top 10%, the kind of like distribution of wealth, if you actually like track those things, they kind of are one-to-one, union membership and that distribution of wealth. So, in some ways, architecture is unique in this case and is also not, right? Like, many other industries have kind of seen declines in membership that had some pretty strong union ties. And so for us, it's sort of like, I think the biggest question, and it's kind of to Jay's point, is us understanding that we are labor. And maybe for some people that feels bad, sure. Right? Like, yeah. It's kind of saying, like, oh, if I'm just labor, then I don't have as much control as I think I do. Mm-hmm. Or if I join a union, then I can't own a firm someday, or I can't be a partner of this firm. Mm-hmm. And all of those are fallacies, right? Mm-hmm. Like, both, you can do those things, but also at the same time, what's a fallacy is our ability to kind of become partners at big firms is actually really minimal. Yeah. Right? Like, that doesn't exist for a lot of people.
Yes. Let's be real.
Yes, no, that's a very, very good point. Gosh, so many questions. I love the example you said of in certain professions, and definitely architecture is one of them, where employees at whatever levels become, I have a cameo.
There's the kitty.
Become very close with the founders or the senior partner, the owners of the office, and you have this relationship with them. And I like what you said about, I do agree that most employees in that position would feel awkward about it. I don't want to feel like that I'm making you think, the owner, that I'm trying to, have my pitchfork and I'm marching against you. But at the same time, I think it's employees and workers do have to understand that, how do I put this, that the owner fully understands the relationship because they're the one paying you. So the perspective that an owner has of their employees is, no matter how close that relationship is fundamentally different than what the employee thinks. And employees, especially younger ones, the ones that you said were more precarious, even have a greater tendency to not understand that concept. But I can guarantee you, your boss still thinks of you as the employee, and he understands himself as the boss. But but for some reason, employees don't quite understand that perspective, if that makes sense what I'm saying.
It does, completely and utterly. And I think it's really, we might just have a cat now. And that was sort of my jump. But yeah, I think it's really important to the process, and it's sort of understanding that and unpacking that. And again, what we say to most people, especially new groups of people that we organize with, or, new people that we meet through these groups, the reality is, most of this, even if the employer has that clear understanding of, like, who is labor and who is not, or who's contributing to what and who's not. Most of these things that are toxic, that might be, or even not, right? That are just kind of like, oh, I didn't know you were working that much, or it was only implied, or, whatever it is, or might have kind of conceptions in their heads. The whole point is, like, most bosses aren't bad. Most bosses aren't malicious. They're not like trying to make you have an awful time. There are plenty that are, sure. Right? But most bosses aren't, right? They just don't necessarily know what the law is. They don't understand what labor law looks like. They don't really actually understand what the possibilities for a contract are for their employees. They also, frankly, like, don't fully understand antitrust laws either, right? And I think that's one of the big kind of pieces to a lot of this conversation that, I think one of the biggest issues with value in architecture is that we've put ourselves behind the 8 ball with our fee structures for so long, and because of these AIA Supreme Court cases against the AIA that the DOJ brought in 1972 and 1990, basically established that two firm owners can't be in a room talking about their fee structures together, or else that's collusion, right? And worse, even if it's two firm owners saying, we are not going to do this competition, that is technically collusion as well, right? Really? And it's like those cases were specific to architects, but obviously they affected a lot of different professions, and law doesn't have the same problems we do, right? And I think they've figured out ways of kind of working around these things. Architecture hasn't, but one thing that is really at our the tip of our fingers is the fact that labor unions are exempt from antitrust laws, right? So workers coming together is not collusion. It's actually them accessing rights and potentially lifting industry standards from the ground up and changing things that if you establish a bar for, basically labor can't go below this, and that's entertainment industry, right? Like, sure. And granted, that's 80 years, 90 years of heavy unions, but that's what comes with it, right? Is kind of saying, all right, well, this is bare minimum. We can't do any cheaper. And actually what comes with that with the entertainment industry is there's not this, oh, can I undercut you? It's, all right, who has the best ideas? And I think that's something we want in architecture, is to kind of say, all right, who has the best ideas, not who is going to undercut who.
Right. So antitrust law. So the specific example of, again, two different partners from different offices not being allowed to speak about their fee structures is an example of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court cases were kind of about AIA putting out sort of example fee schedules that were sort of like sanctioned. And, technically it wasn't two firm owners talking about things, but what the fallout from that has basically been that any two owners talking about it would be collusion.
So let me ask kind of a blanket question from what you just had said. So what are some of the key basic things that firm owners should know that most don't, regarding this kind of stuff?
I mean, the first is that these are worker rights and they're all federally protected, right? So like, even if you don't necessarily want that to happen, it's really not about you ultimately. And it's sort of what the workers want. And really the way these things are structured, there's a lot of hoops to jump through, but the way they're structured is you just have to ask for them. And it's about groups of workers kind of coming together saying, and it's having the conversations, right? It's not like, oh, I'm just going to do it and that's it, right? Like, you have to educate your peers, you have to do these things, but effectively you're saying, yes, we, a group of workers or a majority of a group of workers, want to be represented by a union, want to form a union, and we want those federally protected rights.
And the main thing that employers should know is that a union, which sometimes, because we're not really all that familiar with what a union is, especially in architecture, we think of it like as this big thing. But it's really a way to for us to just sit down and write a contract together in a way that's negotiable. Like, both sides are negotiating things that will be impacting wages, hours, and working conditions of your employees. So basically, that's all we're allowed to have a say in, and that's what a union is there for. The representation is just that it allows for workers or the employees to have access to resources. Let's say we are now being represented by the machinists. We really are the ones who, as employees, decide who from the union is going to be there, and what resource we actually need to sort of access in order to help us negotiate for things that we want in this contract. So if there's accounting that we want to kind of decipher on our end, and we as workers, like employees, don't really have that kind of knowledge, then we can reach out to the resources at the machinist, for example. And so that's what we would mainly rely on the machinists for. And a lot of times when we go into conversations with an employer about a union, the first thing that comes up is the idea that that the union is a third party, and that they're coming in to prevent direct conversation between employees and employer. And that's also a fallacy. It's not a true description of what's going on. It's basically, first of all, like, we as employees decide what we want to do, what we want in that contract. We're the ones basically calling the shots on our end, of course. The union is there to support the decisions that we make, really, and again, to provide the resources. And on the employer side, if the employer has lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, all of that, on our side, we can have the same, so that the conversation can be like a equal conversation coming from a level playing field, rather than one that's unbalanced.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting. So really the union is there to kind of, like you said, like help represent the workers within the firm. Because I would think, okay, look, I have a problem working so many hours. You don't pay me enough. I'm just going to either go talk to my boss, or if you're in a bigger company, go to the HR person and have a conversation. But you guys are right. If there is more than one person in the office that feels the same way, then you can't have every single person go one by one, fight their little fight and maybe make it work for themselves. It's much more of a bigger collective issue, right? And therefore you need it to be represented in a certain way.
Exactly. And I mean, I'm the type of person who just will sit down and put my heads down and just do the work. Even though I've been very vocal about my frustrations with the profession now, but it comes to show that what empowers me is the fact that I'm working with something that will reduce the risk of being vocal about these things. But when I am in an office, in the past 10 years of having experience in this profession, I basically do as I'm told. I don't ask for anything that or question anything that I'm given in terms of raises. So I very much am not of the type of person that would go to HR and complain about things, So if I have the backing of other people along my side that are voicing the same thing, then I'm much more likely to be vocal.
That's a very good point. That's a super, super good point, because that would be the case for probably the majority of people, because it takes a lot of guts to do what Marina describes, and there's fallout potentially. I mean,
there's repercussions.
I've seen firsthand, experienced it, and I've always said kind of, if there's fallout, then it was kind of meant to be in a certain way. But of course, that's in some ways also not a fair thing to expect for somebody, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And, a lot of times you can sort of deduce that that's, a personality trait, that you're not going to, you just don't have the personality, or, you just have to work on yourself to get the courage to go up to your boss and ask for that raise or whatever it is that you want change. But if you look at it from a DEI perspective, you're looking at a systemic issue. Right. There are reasons why certain types of people within our profession don't go up to their boss, who may not look like them. A lot of times you have people who are more inclined to ask for what they want, who look like their bosses. So if you, as a woman of color, is not represented in leadership, you're much less likely to go up to your boss to actually ask what it is that you need. So if you look at all of these things through a DEI lens, you'll see that unionizing would allow our profession to become more inclusive, more diverse, more just by the fact that it's giving voice to a lot of us who are afraid of speaking up.
Right.
Real quick, what is DEI?
Oh, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So does the union has to be created in the company in which it's supposed to represent its people, right?
Yeah, I think getting an understanding of kind of the body of the union, where it exists, sort of is a bit elusive to us still.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? And I think we have, again, we have these examples of the entertainment industry and the construction industry, and certainly things in Europe that we're seeing crop up in architecture, and have, some in Scandinavia, like Norway and Denmark, have versions of this, right, that are more kind of industry wide. That's not really how it works in the United States. And even when you look at the entertainment industry, pretty much everyone there is an independent contractor. So having a sort of like industry-wide union is possible because technically they're all their own boss, right? So like that's how it works. For people that are on W-2s, that are employees, the way the labor law is set up is that you go workplace by workplace. And that obviously takes way more time and is much more difficult. But at the same time, I think, especially in the architecture industry, given, we can talk about like 1,000 employee companies that have, 5 offices in the States and then 10 worldwide. And then you can talk about companies that have 20 employees, right? And literally everything in between, and frankly, even below that of like a couple employees. There is benefit then, right? That what we're talking about is not like a standard contract that everyone would kind of be abiding by, but you actually, as a group of workers, you are forming a union, you negotiate with your bosses, and you come up with a labor agreement, a contract that is specific to your workplace. Now, can it have clauses and verbiage from other precedents? Absolutely, of course it can. But it's kind of picking and choosing, and that's what Jay was sort of talking about with me as an organizer or a negotiator. I might make suggestions to a group and sort of say, hey, these are the things you could do, and we really recommend that you definitely go after these things. But at the end of the day, it's your choice what you want. And we were really successful with this group this way, and that's a good parallel. But ultimately, you guys have to make a choice, and you might say, well, 2 out of those 5 things make no sense for us because this is how we work here, right? And it's like, but you didn't mention those 3 things. Could we bargain for those? And it's like, sure, yeah, we can go after that and let's do that, right? And so again, there's real pluses and minuses to this, and how you go about it. But yeah, ultimately it's workplace by workplace, and it's a group of workers within a workplace coming together as a union.
So each of the unions, in the case of the architecture office is in the United States, each union is within its own office. Is that right?
Yes and no. So the labor law sort of talks about like a community of interest. And basically that's like if work, let's say work is directed out of New York, but there's like an office in Raleigh and there's an office in Cleveland, right? And everyone gets their sort of direction from the New York office.
Okay.
In all likelihood, that could be one bargaining unit.
Okay.
And that would be okay. But a lot of offices obviously don't work that way, where those 3 offices would be kind of their own financial centers, their own production centers, like whatever.
Even though they're the same firm title. Right.
Totally.
Okay.
And in those cases, usually you'd break them up. And you're seeing that with Starbucks. Starbucks actually, when Buffalo, like there was like 4 or 5 stores at first in Buffalo, Starbucks actually tried to file with the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, the sort of government agency that oversees all of the labor law and oversees union elections. They actually filed with them and said, and this is, Howard Schultz and and company management saying, well, they should all be one bargaining unit. And the board basically said, well, is this a community of interest? Do they work together? Do they go from store to store? Are they only it sounds like they're only at one store ever and they don't talk to these other people. No, they're individual units. And that's actually what those workers wanted, because it makes sense, right? Like they don't work with those other people. It's about us as a group. And yes, there's solidarity across that, but we as a group are going to work together.
So how is the solidarity that is across multiple office locations formed? And is there ever an aspect of the union that, how do I say this, is shared between completely different offices? Or is it truly off firm by firm, I should say?
I'll maybe talk about the first, but you probably have some good examples of the latter. So for the first, it's mostly organic, honestly. And we had a group that, it started with a couple of people in New York, and we thought, as we were strategizing with them, that in all likelihood, because of how they work, they're super distributed. They have many offices around the country. And sort of there's lots of cross collaboration, and there's kind of no hierarchy, I think, in a good way, in terms of like who works on what. And I think that allows them to be nimble just as a company. But within like a week or two, they were like, hey, hold on, we might be onto something really big. One of us talked to somebody else in another office that we didn't really know. And it turns out that there's like 6 other people that have been talking for like the last couple of months about the idea of unionization. So we want to get with that group and sort of see if we can combine efforts. And that happened. And it was sort of this like really amazing synergy that happened just organically. Like we as a machinist weren't connected to them. AWU wasn't connected with them. They might have like seen some stuff, right? But they were just talking on their own. And so that kind of organic play happens all the time, which is really exciting. And, sometimes it doesn't, right? And you want to like figure out, all right, who knows who, what's a potential in? Does somebody know somebody that used to work there that's transferred to a different location that could maybe talk to somebody that's still there? All of those kinds of things. But most often it just really happens organically.
I guess part of those two questions came from my thinking. You were describing before the challenges of an individual employee. The kind of personality of being able to approach a senior level person at the office for certain things, but also the knowledge and education and the resources that are lacking if you're just one person, and especially if you're like 26 years old. Why would you know about any of this stuff? But so the kind of the sharing of resources, or having access to a bigger level of resources, I was curious, like, does that take place again across different offices or across different firms, or is still every office more or less left to their own to try and figure that stuff out? Does that make sense?
Both.
Yeah, I think because one thing that we always talk about when we're talking about the AWU is the fact that we can't do this in isolation. Like, firms alone cannot be spearheading, raising standards for the profession. So we talk about density and how important that is. Each firm will have their own contract, but each time you write a contract, you're going through a whole procedure that you're learning. And of course, that kind of information will definitely be information that's shared amongst other firms. And when another, let's say we establish the first contract, another firm will establish, let's say, the second contract. Hopefully the idea with the AWU is that contract is made available for that second firm to kind of base their contract off of it. There are a lot of things that we're going to be talking about for the first time, or reflecting on and improving upon now for the first time, given 100 years. The AIA has been the one spearheading, what is our salary, really? They have a salary calculator, which a lot of people are very critical of. So I think we're going to take that and look at that and with a critical eye and start thinking, and especially considering considering other professions, because we know for a fact architects are undervalued. We're undervalued as a profession. Maybe it's the antitrust laws that are driving our value down, but also likely the AIA for not,
let's face it,
allowing that to happen, whatever limitations that they may have, legally or not. It is the reality. They did that, by the way, in the 1930s, when the Depression hit, yes. There was actually a union in the US in the 1930s of architects. It was called the Federation of Architects, Chemists and Technicians.
Really?
Yes, the FACT and engineers. FAECT. FAECT.
Super confusing. Yeah.
A lot of people together.
So that's interesting. So what happened with that?
Yeah. So back then in the 30s, and correct me if I get anything wrong here, but a lot of the private sector work in architecture got kind of closed down and taken over by the public sector. A lot of architects actually started what became public sector employees, and in that time there was also an establishing of architecture wages, and the I guess the government, some entity was deciding or helping decide that, and the AIA was kind of the main sort of vehicle for that information. So the AIA kind of lowballed architects to, I don't remember what the actual numbers were. Architects got really angry and decided to create a group to go to DC and advocate for the wage that they actually thought they deserved. And they actually got it. No thanks to the AIA. But so they actually got the wages that they wanted. And then after that, as a result, they started the union. And it was so it was not only architects who got involved with that. Then, the chemists, technicians, and engineers also joined, and they formed the FACT.
Yeah, and it existed from like 1930. I'm almost positive on these dates, but 1933 to 1947. And again, it was predominantly public sector workers, but we have some pretty good evidence that they were working with private sector employees to at least access collective bargaining rights. And believe it or not, in the 30s and 40s, it was very easy to unionize. Unions were very strong. Companies were kind of fearful of unions, and so even the kind of like threat of the possibility of a union drive, I think, led to a lot of concessions very quickly. And so this group was kind of helping. Like, again, we don't have any evidence necessarily that any private sector employees, like firm by firm, were unionized, but we know that they were working directly with them to kind of get these rights.
Yeah, there's some written information about private sector firms who were actually part of the FACT, but I think a lot of documentation is still yet to be collected.
Yeah, it'd be a really good history. But to your point, just about the idea of information too. There's a lot of really amazing articles that were published even before, obviously, Peggy Deemer and Jess Myers and a number of other folks that have been talking about these issues for quite some time now, well before AWU was kind of even conceived. And actually, frankly, were sort of instrumental to a lot of what we were thinking. So, when we were putting this stuff together as a group at SHOP, we had Google Drives and we had, we were kind of like sharing information back and forth and creating spreadsheets and presentation decks and kind of all this stuff that I think led to a wealth of information. Some of it obviously probably shouldn't be shared with anybody for many different reasons. Some of it probably wasn't like fully accurate, or some of it probably wasn't like fully polished or whatever. But what came out of that and what we've been using is a very kind of like polished package of things. And so that's almost like a starter kit in some ways that we give as the machinist to every group. And it's sort of like, all right, here's something to start with. You likely know nothing about unions other than what you've Googled or what you've read or whatever it might be. Here's a really good kind of starter kit. And here's some history on FACT. Here's some labor notes stuff. Here's a couple of presentation decks. Here's some articles from Peggy, like a bunch of different things to get the conversation rolling. And that's also helpful then for them to basically say, once they start having conversations, people are immediately like, well, I feel like I need some more information. I need to learn stuff. And then you can kind of be like, well, here's all of this stuff. Like, let's follow up in a week or two and talk through it.
Yeah. And one reason why I was also mentioning the wage advocacy work that was done in the 30s is because we're going to have to do that again now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And so I don't even know where we're going to start, but what we do get with unionizing is access to information.
Right.
We get access to the books of the firm. So few of us will get access to the accounting books of the firm. Just as a little caveat, I mean, so once you create a union within the workplace, your collective bargaining unit, which is all the employees who are eligible to be part of that union, will elect a few people within that collective bargaining unit to be the bargaining committee. So, and those few people will be the representatives of all the people within that firm who are part of the union in the moment where negotiations take place. So basically, what was my point with that?
Right to information.
Right to information. All those tangents aside. So sorry about that. Right to information. So when you get access to the books, we're going to start seeing patterns, of, let's say, salary distribution, who's getting what are the types of people who are getting less. Is it, based on gender? Is it based on race? Can we start, trying to bridge that gap? Can we distribute it more fairly, amongst people? And all of that information will be something we will negotiate, but it's something we're going to have to take on ourselves, looking at other professions, like I was mentioning before. How do they establish their salaries? Is it something that's transparent? Is it something that's a tier? Is it something that's like pretty set, and then you can improve upon that, as you, based on your performance, let's say. So all of those things are debatable, and those things are going to be things we'll be discussing at length, creating a contract from scratch for the architecture industry, or for the first architecture firm, whichever one that does that, hopefully very soon, will be a lengthy process. It might take a year or more. But it will be something that is going to be a body of knowledge that's going to be like, we're going to want to share that with all of our, comrades, who are also organizing, because they're the next group of people who unionize. They're going to be improving upon that,
right.
And we can't, and we always talk about this, like our first contract may be crappy, or, it will definitely be better than like the office handbooks that I've seen, because in a lot of firms, we don't even have a contract. We just like sign some kind of handbook manual that's on a Google Drive that gets changed, and by surprise, when I look at it again, it's like a completely new document. Speaking from experience. Hoping nobody had seen the changes.
or suggesting that it even exists, which many firms it doesn't.
I was going to say, it's on a Google Drive? Wow, it's very...
kind of impressive, actually. Well, I mean, and to clarify, like the right to information is obviously really powerful, and it's sort of something that might be scary for a lot of people too. The point of that, and just to like make clear what the intent really is, right, is so that because I think what was happening, and I don't know the full history of when this kind of like got put in, but I think what was happening was unions were asking for ridiculous things, right, that made absolutely no sense. And so it was like, well, how can we make proposals if we don't understand what the finances of the company look like, right? What's the revenue? What's the overhead? How much are we spending on salary? What is it? What are we spending a lot of money on our health plan and nothing on our vision plan? Any number of other things, right? And you can, as Jay was mentioning, you can kind of ask for salary trends. You basically have to, it's almost the same as like FOIA, right? Like you ask for specific things and then they have to provide some version of it. But again, the point is so that you can look at that and say, all right, this is a zero sum, right? And so let me figure out how we can shuffle these things to make it more equitable and better for us, right? And obviously some of it is, okay, well, we want to work together to make the firm more profitable so that we win on that too. And I think, this probably goes back to another question from before, but like, we all love our jobs, right? Like that. And I think that gets lost in this conversation, that it's like, oh, it's these people that hate architecture and just kind of want to tear it down and want to make it so much worse and like want to stifle innovation and do all these things. It's like, no, we all really love what we do. We love designing. We love working with clients. We love working with communities. We just want to feel supported and sustainable in doing it and feel like we are tugging on the same string, right? Or rope or whatever, and doing it in a way that is not hanging ourselves, right? Yeah. It's actually doing it in a way that we can all benefit from it and benefit equally from it. And I think that's a really critical kind of point of all of this.
That's a fantastic perspective, and you're totally right. So to have access to that kind of information, you'd have to first have a union. You'd have to be a union for that to keep. Yeah, I can't just go up to my boss and be like, give me the stats. I could.
But what would they do? They'd say no.
And we asked.
No, and I mean, this goes to the point before, right? Like from Marina's point of, some intrepid designer might have the gumption to go ask for it, but like what person would actually say, yeah, sure, I'm going to show you all of this, right? Like that's just not going to happen. Or, they might show you some version of it, but it's only to their benefit of what they're actually giving, right?
So is there a minimum of people that need to kind of like group together to start a union? It could be any number of the employee in an office starting it?
I think technically it has to be 3.
Okay.
I mean, I think, like that small.
The boss and the 2 people?
No, I think three people in the unit. I think that's like sort of the breaking point. Like you can't have a bargaining unit of 1, right?
Right.
That being said, under a certain amount, maybe it doesn't make all the sense in the world, right? Like it's not that it's not possible. You just have to like kind of think about it like that. But the point is, no, it can be any size. And again, you're seeing that with Starbucks, right? Like some of the stores are 5 or 10 employees, and they're all forming the union, right? And most stores are no bigger than 30 or 35 employees. And I think that's a really good precedent, like, because most I mean, I know there's so many architecture firms that are sole practitioners or 1 or 2 employees, but like, there's such a huge swath of the architecture industry that's like somewhere between 5 employees and 20 employees, right? Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing. And actually, interestingly, I think we're seeing more pushback from those employers than even big ones. And it's kind of counterintuitive. And it took me a while to sort of unpack that, but a lot of that is coming from fear. A lot of that is coming from Jay's point from before, like, oh, maybe like I don't have somebody on retainer, or like, what does that do to my other costs that I don't really have right now? And I think one of the things that's lost in that too, though, is this point of, okay, most of those firms are the firms that don't have the policies on Google Drive, right? Like they don't have anything written down. And so if you can look at this actually as a way of saying, all right, well, I don't have these and I do want to grow a little bit. Like I want to go from 5 employees to 10 employees. But like you need some kind of strategy for that. You need some kind of buy-in. You need the people that are there to feel really secure about everything too. And wait, this group of people wants to come together to talk about these things, and they want to write some of these policies, and they're going to tap into, union organizers that know how to do a lot of this stuff. Like, maybe this is actually really helpful to me in doing something that I've never done before, and I don't know how to do, and I would have to pay a lot of people a lot of money to do for me, or like hire a, consultancy firm to do for me. Or just struggle through it and frankly throw away hours that you shouldn't be throwing away. Why not listen to your employees? Why not take them at face value? Why not look at it as like, okay, this isn't adversarial. I can benefit from this.
Right. I guess it is the stigma surrounding the word union, because for me, I'm not educated in any of this, right? But somehow I do know that that the employer is supposed to feel a sense of fear when they hear the word union. Now, why do I know that? I have, through media, through whatever, all the things you've mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Is it not possible for there to be a profession-wide union? Because it seems that especially for a smaller sized office and a smaller group of employees, it would be much easier for them to join an existing thing and wear an AWU badge or whatever union badge and say, okay, we're just joining this thing. They already have baseline policies in place. So sort of like, the five of us, let's say, the five of us are not creating things from scratch. We're just joining the club. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, the short answer is it sort of goes back to how, like, if labor law were different in this country, I would say, yeah, let's do that. And that sounds awesome. And maybe that's actually a place that we can do some work over the next 10 years. And I say we as like the entire labor movement of giving more possibilities for that kind of a relationship, especially because I mean, all of these laws were written for heavy manufacturing in the 1930s and 20s, right? And talking about like hundreds of workers with like one or two supervisors. Right. And that's and like basically we haven't really reformed much of the legislation since then. Right. And what you're seeing now, right, obviously, especially as heavy manufacturing barely exists in this country, is that the vast majority of laborers are professionals and sit behind a computer for 8 to 10 hours a day. Architects sometimes way more than that, obviously. And, I do think we need to do some work around that. But the short answer is no, we can't do that. I think there's some interesting possibilities with things like worker co-ops, cooperatives that could bridge some of those gaps. And I think, there's some disagreement on this, but I think having union frameworks to those as a democratic process might make some sense. And so the interesting thing for me about worker cooperatives is it's sort of this idea of like, okay, well, I'm a sole practitioner. I might have one or two employees. And I'd really like to go after that project, but I don't know how to flex it, right? To have more people potentially. And if I don't get it, then that's a problem. If I'm part of this worker cooperative, then I can tap into a larger network of people that we all have the same idea of governance. We all have the same idea of how we want to distribute work and reward, right? Funding and income. But worker cooperatives have the same sort of problem, right? Like that they're in New York, especially, they're actually really sort of like difficult to form. And there's a lot of red tape. And so it's like, states like Colorado have really friendly laws towards that. And what you see, people that are really kind of intrepid on this and want to do it will incorporate like in Colorado and then sort of like get reciprocity in the state that they're actually going to practice in. And we have a couple of examples of that, but I know that's a big side tangent, but that's a different way of addressing it potentially.
I see.
Gotcha. So I came up with a group of people. We're going to do a union. Do we have to register the union to officially exist?
Yeah, what are the steps?
A process?
What do we do after we have the motivation and we have the group chat? We have nothing else.
Right? Very, very important part of the process is the group chat. the internal comms, super, super important. Yeah. The short steps, right, are and just to kind of lay them out, even though I think we're past some of these, but the short steps are let's talk about common interests, right? And let's actually understand that we all sort of feel the same way about these things. And we all think these issues are not just this workplace, they're systemic, or maybe some of them are, but that I'm not alone in feeling them. Let's do that first. Let's talk to our coworkers. The next one is to reach out to an organizer to sort of design what the process looks like. Who would be in the bargaining unit, who would be out. We haven't really talked about that, but people like HR and legal and accounting, obviously firm owners, not in the bargaining unit. And then we use this term called supervisory, which again, sort of written for heavy manufacturing. But so that's not like project architects or project managers, but it's sort of people that like oversee staffing or like oversee like 6 different projects and kind of like move people around wouldn't be included.
Who can hire and fire.
Totally. Gotcha. Yeah, that's the easiest one.
A certain level of power, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And so they're sort of out of the bargaining unit, but everybody else is in with obviously some exceptions, you can figure that out, but you design the process, right? And like, what does that look like? Then you build majority support. And this is sort of by what the labor law calls showing of interest. And that used to be like signing a union card. And this was like a really big deal back in the day, like a physical card, and you submit that. And then like you'd walk on the boss to Maria's question, like, how would we do this? We would walk on the boss with like 100 cards and slap it on their desk, right? It's this big collective action.
Yeah, see? This is our deck of cards.
but now, of course, it's all just like it's a link. Digital form, no big deal. Yeah. But the nice thing about that is you fill out your information, but that doesn't go to your boss specifically. That's like the union collects that. And we eventually potentially submit that to the labor board as verification that we have the support that we say we do, right?
Okay.
And so once you've built that, and technically you can go for a union election or ask for recognition at 30% support of what the projected unit would be. So if it's 100 workers, you need 30.
Wow.
Pretty simple math. So it's a pretty low threshold, which I think is good. We sort of never recommend that you do that because there's too much unknown. The idea that you're probably going to win an election is kind of low, right? Like you just don't know what's out there, or potentially there's a lot of people that oppose it. So we usually try and set that bar at like 65, 70%. And that sounds high. But the point there is that if you win your election by one vote, the boss knows that, right? Like they know what the vote looks like. They know the numbers. And so then they know the union's not strong, so they can strong arm you in negotiations more. If you go in with a super majority and you have 70% support, it signals to management like the workforce is unified on this. We all have come together. We feel this way, right? And so once you have that level, that's when one of two things happens. And usually the first one happens automatically. We always do it, which is essentially asking the management for voluntary recognition. And the idea there is like, we have the support. We can verify that any way that you want to. We'd love for this process to start right now. It'd be much better if we didn't have to do a whole back and forth anti-union campaign and these things, right, that we've kind of seen very clearly from Howard Schultz and Tim Cook and all these other people and Bezos. That rarely works. It does work sometimes. And so what winds up happening is the management will either say, okay, we want to go to an election, or they kind of just ignore the request altogether. And then you actually do an election.
So a couple questions. So kind of a recap. So the bargaining unit is the term for everyone that's in the union, correct?
Yes.
And so you need the minimum of 30% of the people in the office who are eligible to be part of that bargaining unit, because not everyone is. You said the folks who have hiring and firing power, they can't be part of it. You have technically a minimum to submit your application to the labor board. Almost got it. And is that like a state level entity?
No, it's federal.
Federal. And you recommend having a higher percentage, like 60. And then once it gets filed, then you would notify the head boss that we've officially formed a union. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's the gray area, right? Is like technically you have not you are trying to form a union, right? Like that's what your notification is. Technically, you don't have it until the boss voluntarily recognizes you and says, okay, I see that you have the support. I don't want to fight you on this. It'll cost me more money to fight you on it than it would be to just sit down and negotiate with you, which more often than not is the case. Or they say, okay, let's go to the election. And the election is what allows you to potentially certify. And so if you win the election and you need 50% plus one vote, so in the 100 example, you need 51 votes, yes votes, then you get your certification and then you are officially a union. But, a key point to all of this, and we say this to everybody, is the goal isn't to win the election. It's not to form a union. The goal is to get your contract.
So the election consists of the people who work at the office, right?
that would be eligible for the bargaining.
That would be okay, right?
Yeah.
Hence, the 60, 65 makes more sense.
So the boss can basically try to shut down the union in a way.
But if they don't like it, it still goes to the election, right? That's the ultimate thing.
Exactly. Yeah. If they say, look, I'm not going to voluntarily recognize you, like, good luck with an election, then you file it, you have your election, and you see what happens. This current labor board is making clear that elections are not in workers' best interest, and they're in employers' best interest, because what happens between sort of filing and having the election is the firm or company, whatever we're talking about, whatever industry we're talking about, goes on a sort of offensive to basically tell everybody why a union's a bad idea for them. Right. And why they already have this direct relationship. Their doors are already open. They can come talk to us at any time. Sure. We're always listening. Yeah. We're a family, right?
Yeah,
like
put together an advisory committee instead of a union.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's interesting. So let's say once the union is officially formed, one way or the other, when does how does the contract, the mutually agreed upon contract, how does that happen?
No, I just want to make sure I'm not monopolizing. No, basically, like, you've had an organizing committee that, sounds kind of cloak and dagger, but really is just a group of people that wants the union to happen and is willing to do the background organizing work to make it happen. Once you have the union and you have that certification, you hold elections for who the bargaining committee is going to be. And that, Jay talked about that a little bit before. So that everyone has a voice, right? And so people that might have been anti-union to begin with, they might still have that sentiment, and they might want different people on the bargaining committee. So you have to the whole point of organizing is to meet people where they are and to kind of like hear them for what their issues are and not assume that and so that bargaining committee then once they're elected, they put together a kind of like survey to be like, all right, we have 10 possibilities for things, rank them, right? Like, what's most important to you? And then there's always like fill in the blanks too, right? And like what types of things do we actually, because I think that's also a misconception that, yes, we have ideas about what we want to bargain for before we form the union, but that's not the point, right? The point is to get the rights first and then have the union itself. And then we can talk about what we actually want. We can talk about possibilities, and that's great, but we're not going to make assumptions we're not going to say these are the 5 proposals that we're going to go for, right? Because we don't really know yet, right? And so anyway, once the bargaining committee is kind of in place and they do those surveys, that's when you start to develop proposals. You work with the economists and researchers and lawyers and negotiators with the union to develop what that plan and series of proposals are going to look like.
I see. So how many people would be typically part of a committee for a union that is of, X size?
You usually do like 10%.
Okay.
Roughly, right? Like there's no exact science to this. And I think it's ultimately what the bargaining unit is comfortable with, right? Like if you work at a 20-person office and you want the bargaining committee to be 5 people, I think that's fine. If you work at a place that's like 500 people and you don't want it to be 50 people, right? Like, sure. I think that's fine.
That probably makes sense. I don't know.
No, that would be hard, right? But that's like a rough idea to kind of shoot for.
Gotcha. So it really is, once from the very beginning to even after the union is formed, it really is just a room of everyone sitting down, talking, and figuring out how they want to go on this journey. And probably, I would imagine a lot of times it comes down to a vote because it seems to be what's fair, and you kind of move forward in that sense.
So if out of the 100 employees, right, 70 voted to have the union happen, they want it, what happens with the 30 left in the office that didn't want the union? Right?
They're out.
No. We don't talk to them anymore.
They're on their own.
They don't have to follow what the union is going to bargain for, right?
So, I mean, in one way, the answer to your question is yes. In one way, it's no. So they are represented by the union. That sort of period, right? Like when you as a group win the election, everyone that would be part of the projected bargaining unit, and again, the labor law is a little backwards about this, but it's by job title. It's not like individuals. So it's like if you have that job title, then you're represented by the union.
Okay.
Again, if you really don't want to be, I don't kind of know what to tell you.
Good luck.
But the yes to your kind of question is that, you can, because it's a democratic process, even if you voted no, you could be on the bargaining committee. And if you don't want to do that, even if you voted no, you can make proposal suggestions, right? And if you let's say you wanted to organize around, 3 different concepts, you could, and that's totally open to you. And I think the whole point of all of this is to have meetings that are open, that are accessible, that anyone can share their opinions, that anyone can put, sort of things on the docket that they want to. And then ultimately the group votes. And if the group votes in favor of it, great. If they don't, then it's not going to be something that happens.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also for anyone who's tried to form a group of some kind and it's extracurricular, let's call it, it's really difficult to do until you get to certain kind of official level, whatever that means, whether it be a logo, right, or whatever. Unless it happens, it's impossible almost. The statistics are against you. So technically, I don't think it matters so much. But technically, if a union is formed, and I was one of the 30 people that Marina described, I'm part of the union, right?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, there's always a couple random balls in the office that are pretty happy with whatever condition they're working in, doing charrettes every night, 90 hours a week. They're totally fine with that lifestyle. They have no issue with it. I just want to be, careful about what happens to these people. So.
What happens to these people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and it's also important in the process, because they're also eligible to be part of the collective bargaining unit, or because they're a part of it, it's important for them to feel included, right? Because the more cohesive a voice we can harness, the better the outcome, So we never want to alienate anyone. That's the last thing that we want. So anytime that you have someone who's neutral or who's maybe more on the anti side, we're always interested in continuing to have conversations with them. One-on-one conversations are super important in any of our organizing. So we talk and listen, and they have certain perspectives, and they're the things that they're interested in having addressed in the contract are also important, because there's never an isolated issue. It's always something that's felt, across the board by multiple people. So it's always good to also hear, their side as well.
Yeah.
So in the organizing that I've been a part of, we always make sure to include them as much as possible. It's very important.
Well, and Marina, I think one of the parts of this too, and I think it goes back to the misconception, right, is and I've heard a lot of groups talk about this kind of in the background, because an interesting thing has happened, obviously, as the shop campaign went public, that now we're talking about with groups of workers that might have had some open conversations in the office about unionization in architecture, right? Or just the concept of it. And some probably panicked firm owners, we got to talk about this in some way, right?
Yeah.
And some really interesting things kind of come up, that people are really fixated on the idea of standardization. And it's that's not the point, right? And what we're not suggesting at all, actually, is that every firm has to be the same, or that everyone has to have the same salary or whatever it is, right? I think this is actually where it helps to go firm by firm in a lot of ways, or company by company, that you can cater to the individual group's needs quite a bit. And I think what's better in a lot of these instances is, all right, let's set salary floors for titles, right? And work up from there. And you know what, if you, and not put prohibitions either on individual negotiations, right? So if somebody wants to, go ask for more, that's fine, right? Yeah. And I think you see that in the entertainment industry very clearly, right? They're about setting minimums so that the working actors, working grips, all these people, they have a living wage, right? And they have a clear understanding of what they make when they walk on set. But, The Rock and Charlize Theron and these crazy rich people that like make $20 million a movie, they have a contract on top of that base contract, sure. Right? And I think that we're not saying that that's not possible. It is. It absolutely is. And, you know, I think the other part for me is like, because all of this for me, like my one issue has always been uncompensated overtime. I have no problem working extra hours. Sometimes it's necessary, and I totally understand that. My biggest issue with it is, why are we not compensated for that? And I both mean that as individual workers and us as a company, right? And I think this is something that the industry has done a really bad job of, even to the point of like, okay, if a client is not going to approve it, that's fine. Still put it in their lap and let them know that this team worked, I don't know, $100,000, $300,000, $1 million, whatever it is, a fee extra to produce this, you know, extra deadline or design change or bulletin or whatever it is that was never in the contract. Let them know at least what that is, right? And I think coming back to that idea that like, we're not saying nobody should work overtime when it's needed. We're saying, let's get paid for it.
Yeah.
And so for those people that want to work 90 hours, like, cool, get paid for it.
You get paid more money.
How is that bad?
I like the super specific thing you brought up at the very end about letting the client know. This is somewhat of a tangent, but we were just talking this morning before this recording, like literally about that, about, you know, for ourselves, but offices in general who do all this extra work, extra hours or extra options, extra whatever, which is, if there's a good contract, it's clearly stated as additional services, right? But architects just do it. And I love what you said of, okay, look, you shouldn't, but if you're going to do it, you should at least tell the client, put it in an email and say, hey, you know, we're past the options, but we did option 5 for you because we like you or whatever reason, but just know that we did this for free. And I think there's hesitancy for architects to do that because they don't want to seem petty. They don't want to, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but it's really not that bad. And it's just allowing everyone to have access to the same information, right? Because this is a very specific example of the employer and the client. The client's not going to keep track of that stuff for you, right? So, and actually, it's kind of unfair to a certain degree to a year later or whatever, expect the client to have remembered that and be like, hey, I'm pissed off at you, client, because I did all this extra work and you didn't pay me. And they're going to be like, well, I don't know. I just asked you to do stuff. What are you even talking about? I know. You kept doing it. So
like, you never let me know.
Yeah.
And actually, to your point, like in those contracts, it says we are responsible for notifying them. Right? Yeah. So if you don't notify them, like, and again, you know, there are some really bad clients out there, but most are not malicious, right? Like they're just going to take what you give them. Right. So if you give them like a million extra options or extra renderings or whatever. And I think that's another part of this, right? Is that not only do we not hold our clients' feet to the fire in terms of what the contract does say, we don't do it. Also in terms of options, right? Like sometimes it's like the client's not asking for 10 extra options, but we do them anyway.
Right.
Or the contract says, hey, I need 4 renderings for this submission, and we produce 10. Right. It's like, wait, why? Like, I understand that sometimes you need to do a little bit extra to like convey an idea to make sure that you get buy-in and consensus build and all of these things. But like the degree that we go to in order to get there is disproportionate.
Yeah, totally. The degree,
or the fee actually doesn't even cover that 4th render, right? You know, that you're asking for.
Yeah.
So
it's the degree and the fact that it happens pretty consistently. This is not like a one-off thing every once in a while for the profession.
It's interesting to me. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, you go ahead.
I was going to say it's interesting. I think, Andrew, you mentioned that earlier, that basically an office could use the resources that a union could bring to them to basically maybe like run their business a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully. And I mean, if you even like triggers it down a level higher, maybe even impact the fee and actually how you do business with other people outside of your employee circle, which I think maybe it's maybe too hopeful and maybe really, really far from where you guys are at the moment in what you're trying to do. But I think ultimately that's also like one of the other bigger issue that the profession has, which is really like the value of what we do and how we sell that and how we get paid for it in general.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we can go one contract at a time, right? Like we'll negotiate our first contract with one firm being unionized that won't give that firm too much leverage within the industry because they're the first ones. And so if their employees are asking for compensation for overtime and their fees need to be a little bit higher, or, whatever it is that they decide, however it is that they decide to sort of like distribute the extra cost of paying for those extra hours, if it does end up on the lap of the client, then that probably would potentially impact them, and like they could lose some competitive edge. But if there are a bunch of firms who are asking for the same thing at that level, because they have to, because now they're required to compensate their employees for all the hours that they produce and all the renders, all the options, then they're all going to have much more leverage, right? In like defining what the fees are that whichever client it is that they're asking for.
I want to ask, so back to our kind of fictional union that we've
made. You mean fictional? It's happening.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Just you? Oh, great.
Just you.
We are your organizers. You guys are internally unionizing.
Let's talk, David. What are...
I'm going to start a campaign to prove why you should not be
Let's
a one-person
have a
union.
vote here.
We'll be a stalemate, that's for sure. So after the union's been formed, and we've done the polls and whatnot. We have an understanding as a group of like what we want to do. We have our committee, but how do we get access to the more complicated, economic understandings of how the office runs? I mean, not the information from the office because I guess we can ask for that. But how do we get the knowledge and expertise to understand what that means? How the attorneys to put together a contract? Like, what do I do from this point?
Yeah, I mean, so that's where the union representation comes in ultimately, and that's why you affiliate with a union, that they because all this point, right? If we talk about this fictional office of 100 people, you as a group, the dues that you pay a union like us, that would not get you very far. That would get you like a couple of hours with a lawyer. And maybe like a couple of hours with an economist or a researcher, right? And maybe a negotiator for a little bit just to kind of like put things together. You wouldn't get very much out of them. The point of actually affiliating with a larger union is that you have many collective bargaining units sort of pooling those like little amounts of dues that you're actually paying into a much larger pot of money to pay full-time salaries, right? And to have people on the employee roll that can provide this expertise and can also provide it in a way that's like, I've written 20 contracts. Yes, maybe they're in different, for architecture right now, since there are none that exist, yes, there may be in analogous kind of industries, but we can pull ideas from that. And we've actually done contract training with people too, and kind of been like, all right, and that's evolved over the last 5 months. The first one we did, I think, missed the mark in a lot of ways. It was like, all right, these are ideas. Now what's your feedback? And there was a lot of feedback, right? And it was sort of like, even for me as like becoming an organizer, it was like, ooh, that language sounds really bad. Like that doesn't apply to architecture. We need to rewrite that completely. So it's this kind of back and forth. Once you have union density, like Jay was talking about, that's a totally different ballgame, right? And you have the vocabulary, you have all these things kind of set up, and you can develop them pretty quickly from a kind of series of things. But before that, it really is about tapping into the kind of international or national union that can just frankly put resources behind the project. And to talk about dues for a second, dues don't get paid until the contract's ratified. So like you could organize for a full year and then you could bargain for a full year. Those 2 years, totally free. Like nobody pays anything for those years or for that time, I should say. And it's something that, that's like we know that's sort of just how the system works, but it's also this kind of like, all right, let me get you what you want. And then we can talk about how you pay into it. Right. And once you do, for our union, in Northeast area, it breaks down to about like 1.5% of your salary. Mm-hmm. Most union contracts, if we sort of like at the very minimum, if we combine salary and benefits, are going to get you way more than that. So it sort of pays for itself.
Mm-hmm. So I might have missed the beat here. So within the office, we have the office of 100 people, like we were saying, and they formed a union. But you said that they would link up with an affiliated union, which is what you like in real life do. So you guys are the ones to provide the expert support, right? Yeah. Gotcha.
To that point, in some ways, Jay, like you and a couple of other people like interviewed a bunch of different, like there's many unions, right? Like machinists are one union, right? Like it's who you affiliate with is totally your call as a group of workers. Like obviously, I'm an employee of the machinists. I would love to unionize every architecture firm, but like if people decide they want to go with a different union, that's up to them.
Gotcha.
Right?
I guess the part I got confused was I thought that the office had formed a union, but
it's both.
Okay. So they're both unions, but
yes,
there is experts.
But you're like the union expert or something.
Yeah. And again, I think this is where the labor law is kind of like convoluted on it, that like you have to go workplace by workplace, right. But also, and frankly, Amazon is fully independent, right? Like the union that they won in Staten Island, they are not currently affiliated with any union, any parent union,
okay.
Right? That provides any kind of representation. They're getting consultation from a lot of different unions because they have so much political cachet right now and sort of attention on them, but they are fully independent. And is that a way you can go? Absolutely. Do you then not have experts? Yeah,
likely.
Right. So then then you're kind of figuring it out on your own. And again, I think they're a kind of unique instance where that followed a couple of failed elections, or one failed election in Bessemer, Alabama first with, I think it was with retail workers. And that often happens too, right? Like where you try one and it takes a couple of elections before you get a successful one, right? And so this particular one decided to go independent.
So once a firm's union approaches an affiliated union like yours, as an example, right? They work with you to get everything together and formalize things. Now, I want to make sure I'm clear. So up to that initial point, prior to the contract being signed, all of that is done like at no cost?
Yep.
That's okay. That sounds pretty good.
What are we waiting for?
Yeah. And so the actual negotiating, when it's one person or people on the other side of the table, is it the affiliated union that's typically at the table, or is it the folks who actually work in the office who are there?
Both.
Okay.
And that's really critical to the process. And it sort of depends on how many people, given, the size of the company and all of that, but it's absolutely critical that workers are at the table. And in most cases, bargaining sessions typically are open. So if people want to go, they can. I think some are closed, but at the very least, having a couple, and, it can range from 1 to 3 or 4 union employees, like parent union employees, but having workers at the company that are part of the union at the table, like actually negotiating, I think is really important.
Do you know how many architecture offices in New York are unionized? And do you know the state of the unions in the States?
0.
Wow.
So,
wait, did you say unionized or unionizing?
Right, sure.
Okay, unionizing then.
Sure.
Actually, I think it's a larger question of, so it's real quick, going back to fees. So you said the fees are typically 1.5%-ish or something like that. And typically if the contracts and the way the bargaining goes, you end up getting that back anyway. So it's good. But the Marina's question brings up a kind of a larger one of where we all are in reality with the state of architecture offices trying to unionize. You're describing also that the state of the profession is such that we're kind of in this vicious cycle and there's kind of a ceiling to it. And my feeling is we have to get past that ceiling. And I feel like there's a threshold that once enough people get past it, it'll we have crossed that threshold.
Right.
So I guess the question is, like, who is going to be the first office to unionize? Maybe not by name, but is it going to be a big office? Is it going to have to be like a Gensler in order for this for the ball to be, rolling?
What do you think?
I don't think it matters, but yeah, we can't really say.
But yeah, I think that's what I was going to say. It doesn't matter because to me, and this, goes for the shop workers and obviously for very different reasons. Both of us were not there when they went public, one by choice, one not by choice. But the reality with that is going first is impossible. Yeah. It's just like a very difficult task. There's so much fear. There's so much misinformation. There's not yet a conversation, right? That sparked a conversation around the idea. And frankly, the Starbucks stuff was happening, the Amazon stuff was happening, but like the major kind of impactful moves on that front happened after. And not to say that we were sort of influencing that, because we weren't, but like they happened after. And that's actually made a big impact in terms of what the discussions have been amongst workers. So at this point, I would say it doesn't really matter who's first. It's really getting that first group across the finish line and saying, yes, this is possible. Look, they did it. And that's all it takes. And this goes back again for Starbucks. It's like 6 months ago, there were 0 stores unionized, and now they have 160 as of today, I think. And again, digital media, 7 years ago, there were 0. And I don't know what the numbers are now, but it's fully industry standard. You think about like art workers, museum workers, there were a couple of like legacy ones at like MoMA and maybe 1 or 2 others. Now it's 2019, the new museum unionized. Now it's pretty standard, at least in New York, but it's happening in other cities as well, right? So it takes 1 or 2 to basically say this is possible, for other people to actually galvanize around that and not pick holes in it anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I also want to ask, what is AWU's kind of role in all of this? Because it's not a union, right?
No.
Yeah, I mean, right now, and like Andrew has mentioned, it's kind of in flux. We're always kind of trying to define what it is. But basically right now it's like a platform or a channel where people who are organizing their workplace can come together and share lessons learned, get tips on how to move forward or backwards, just a safe space where we feel okay sharing our experiences of organizing, because there isn't really a safe space like that. The architecture lobby has done some of that, which I still feel very strongly that it's like a very important place for people to at least start getting acquainted with the term unions and just like, like demystifying what that process is, because it takes a bit of courage for someone to reach out to a staff organizer and say like, hey, we want to unionize, or what are the steps, at least for me and for some of my fellow organizers in other firms, like they say the same thing. So at the architecture lobby, it is a nice space where you just like get acquainted, a little bit, tip your toes, if you will, on the whole labor movement. So and you start identifying yourself as a worker. And then when you're serious about it, then you start having like real conversations of like, what is it that it takes to organize? Where can I learn more about it? Okay, let me talk to a staff organizer. Are there other people who are doing the same thing? Can I talk with them? Like, so the AWU is a space where you go for that. And right now also, I mean, the placeholder as we basically, like, the AWU is not a public platform, although it is, there's a public front, which many of us kind of stay back. Like right now, basically it's our Instagram where we, talk about issues and show solidarity with other movements and try to educate the general public and architects about what it is to unionize. So it is an educating kind of platform. but it's also this other space that people don't see, because it is, we're all kind of like afraid of retaliation. We don't like really, come out of our cocoons, to really say what we're doing, because there's the fear of, you getting fired because of your organizing. I've been very lucky because, I was laid off from shop. I wanted to have stayed there. I wanted to see that contract go through. There are lots that happened after the New York Times article came out. And I was laid off like right after that, or actually right before that. And so, yeah, with that, like I was lucky enough to get a job afterwards. Yeah. I did make myself very visible and vocal, but I was able to get a job afterwards. And that's something that people worry about. Like I didn't think I was going to be able to get a job after doing all of that and being public about it.
A couple of questions from that real quick. So what is the Architecture Lobby for people who don't know? It's a website, it's a community. You're not affiliated with them? The AWU is not part of them, or?
Yeah, they're separate entities. So the Architecture Lobby is a all volunteer organization, basically advocating for fair working practices within the architecture profession.
Okay.
And so they have, their own like structure and hierarchies. It's a nonprofit. They have a board of directors that gets elected every year, and they have volunteer, leadership positions as well. And there are many chapters in different cities. In New York City, we have one of the most active ones, and they meet on a like monthly basis. Each chapter really like decides for themselves what topics they want to get active on or advocate for. In the New York City chapter, there was a lot of movement with unions and unionizing. And there's also the Green New Deal group. There are also the academic group. There's the co-op group. So all of these groups are just formed by people who have an interest in learning more, or, starting to come up with projects or programs around, or initiatives around those topics. Gotcha. And so it's really like all volunteer. So, gotcha. And the AWU, on the other hand, has in a way, staff organizers now, because we've affiliated ourselves with the machinists. Andrew and David have come on board to kind of help keep that running, or keep the momentum going. And the main outlet for that is our social media. Gotcha. And I think Andrew can even talk more about that. But on a monthly or so basis, a few of us will meet, a few of us who are part of like what we call the steering committee. And it's just a few people who are interested in like coming together with other firms who are doing similar work. And just, like I said, like sharing information about their experiences in organizing. Gotcha.
Yeah. And, again, right, like since there are no unions in architecture yet, could that change? Possibly. But I think it's something that, I can say as an employee of the machinist, like we feel really strongly about. It's this industry that it's not often that you see an industry. And this is what David said to us when he first met with us. Like it's not often that you see an industry that there is zero unionization to it. It's kind of rare at this point. And so to kind of understand that and understand that there's a lot of potential there too, putting resources behind it has always been an interesting thing for us. And, part of why I got hired before the Times article came out, it was, okay, well, a lot of people are going to reach out to us and we need to kind of be ready for it. And a lot of people have, and some, didn't turn into anything, or some have been like, I think I have a friend that might be interested, or just asking questions. Right. And I think, again, to your question, like the space is really about education and sort of advocacy. And it goes down to things like we're sort of constantly amplifying different messages or different facts or things that people don't necessarily know about the profession. And, you know, I think when we put it up, it was like, okay, well, this might take off a little bit. I don't think we ever expected it to kind of like, it has 14,500 or 14,500 followers on Instagram. It has over 2,000 on Twitter. There's like tons of engagement and comments and direct messages and things like that. And so it's its own kind of animal in a lot of ways, but sort of using that both, as Jay said, to kind of connect to other parts of the labor movement, not just as a way of solidarity, but also as an opportunity to educate the public about the working conditions of architects and sort of how architects have undervalued themselves and each other for a very long time, and how we can start to unpack that. And I mean, you know, our conversations with Noam Scheiber from the Times, you know, when we had those first kind of conversations, he was sort of really shocked, right? Like, I think most people have this conception of architects, like, okay, maybe they're not making what lawyers and doctors are making, but it's probably not that far off.
Yeah.
Right?
People think it's very close.
Totally.
Very glamorous work we're doing.
And he was basically like, wow, your working conditions are worse than journalism. And I didn't think that could be possible. And you guys have to go to so much more schooling than we do. And you guys have to get licenses. I don't understand. And it was like, yes, completely. Right. So that educational component is both sort of educating architects on what the possibilities are, but really shining light on a lot of things that the public might not know. And it's things like, you know, currently licensed architects, only 24% are women, and only, I think it's 5% are Latinx, and 2% are Black, right? Like, those numbers are appalling. And yeah, you know, NCARB and AIA are like working on it or whatever, but they're not, like, the needle's not really moving right now, right? And so thinking about those things and unpacking those things and really thinking about them holistically for a broader audience is critical to the whole kind of effort.
And I just wanted to add about, you know, our affiliation with the Machinists, just because Andrew mentioned it quickly, but we did do some research and interviewed about, was it like 7 other unions? And we, that was maybe, I would say, like, just maybe 3 months after we started talking with David. I think we started talking with David in October 2020. And then like a couple months later, we started just like doing our due diligence, because we knew we were going to start having conversations with the rest of the firm at SHOP. And we were sure that people were going to be questioning or asking, like, why did we choose to affiliate ourselves with the Machinists? And they did. And it's, you know, a fair question. And when we interviewed people and we told them that, like, we were interviewing, we were just like very clear about, you know, transparent about our intentions and interviewing, and that we're already affiliated, you know, so far with the Machinists. And we described, you know, the steps that we had taken, and every one organizer had said, you know, like, they're doing everything that we would have done. Like, it sounds like everything's right. If there's no red flags and they are interested in like taking your effort on, like, stick with them. And also at that point, like, we were a few months out working with David and having weekly meetings with David, you know, that sometimes would last 2 hours, you know. So he was the organizer that had the most knowledge about architects and architecture at that time. And when you put union and architects together, he was then like the only person who knew what we were doing or trying to do, basically. The
bar was on the floor, right? Like, it was set at 0, but he was well ahead of that.
Right.
Yeah. And was showing us, you know, like, that there were resources that we could tap into, when was willing to share them. And some of the, one union was like, well, we would need you to like start your own independent local union. So you need to raise your own kind of resources to run that. We're thinking, like, we're just like barely understanding what a union is. Like, let us alone like run a union would be crazy. So, you know, there was a lot of that kind of groundwork that we did. And after that, we felt confident and comfortable being like, you know what, we're sticking with the Machinists. And David, you know, has always been a great resource and has always made sure that we understand that what we're doing is really up to us. It's like Andrew was saying, like, we design the process. We know that there are some steps that have been proven, that have worked in other fields and other industries. David doesn't know if everything is going to work in architecture. So we have to kind of fill in the blanks there with our creativity, our knowledge, our processes that we kind of like learn and come up with along the way. But there's a lot to be learned. And he's like super open to kind of letting that process just like kind of unwind itself as well and come in whenever like he's needed.
That's amazing. I want to be conscious of your guys' time. Do you have a couple more minutes just to wrap up? Okay. One question we got to ask is, so what are the cons of having a union?
What do you mean?
It's a perfectly viable answer. I'm fine with that. But I mean, I think that would be a question that people would be wondering.
No, it's a totally reasonable question. And I think the first thing that I'll say on this, and we say this to everybody that we work with, unionization is not going to solve all of our problems, right? Mm-hmm. Like it is a tool in the toolkit, and that's what we want to give to workers is that tool that they don't have right now. That's important, but are we going to change the field overnight? And can we solve every single issue that is associated with the field of architecture? No, right? And it's going to take a lot of different efforts, a lot of people coming together to actually do that. But it's one possibility, right? And it's one sort of way of addressing things. I think to me, it's sort of there's so many cons that people try to put on the table that are really just like falsehoods or straight up lies that I think that are sort of easier to point to. And we've talked about a lot of them today already, but, like the idea of standardization or something we haven't talked about, like you'll have to go on strike. That's always a big one. And again, striking is a tool and it's very successful. It's also really hard on workers. And frankly, we don't recommend it. And, for our union, it's like 99.5% of campaigns end without a strike because people don't want to do that, right? Like it's hard. The problem is that strikes get the outside sort of like publicity, right? Which is why they're an effective tool. But the idea that like you'll have to do it and that's a bad thing is just wrong, right? Like you have to vote to do it. Again, like we can't tell workers to do it. The workers have to decide that they want to. Also things like you can't speak to your boss anymore. Like that's an obvious thing that, it's like people say that though, right? And it's like, well, no, of course you can still have a conversation. It's like how you structure the language. If you put it in your contract that like you're not allowed to talk to your boss about anything, then sure, you can't do that. But like nobody's going to do that, right? Like the employer doesn't want that, and you as workers don't want that. So to me, the kind of question of like what are the cons? It's more about what are the cons that are being put out there as a sort of PR campaign, and let's unpack those because I think there's more of those than there actually are cons to unions at all.
Yeah, I do want to add that, like realistically speaking, unionizing is very hard. So the con is that it requires constant work. It's something that you have to take the time to have those conversations with all your coworkers. Try to figure out what the heck you're doing. What are the steps that you have to do? We have weekly meetings, sometimes twice a week, and we're constantly meeting and trying to figure out like, how do we approach this question from our boss or whatever? It's not easy. So one of the main reasons why unions in architecture don't exist is that it's a lot of work and we're overworked. How do we expect us to take extra time from our own jobs to like actually do the work that, our employers, I guess, should be doing? Yeah. And then, but at least like when you're doing that work, like you are protected, by law, you're allowed to organize your workplace. You're allowed to speak about working conditions. All of these things are protected by the law. So even though we're all at will employees that we can be fired at any moment, when you're organizing, the pro is that you are protected.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you guys could talk about what happened at SHOP for those of the people listening who didn't read the articles or didn't understand. So there was an effort to unionize, and that actually didn't end up happening. Did it get to an election process?
The sort of short answer is right before the new year, so December 20th or 21st, or right around then of last year, 2021, the workers filed, notified the firm owners that they wanted to form a union, asked for voluntary recognition, and then ultimately filed for an election. And that election was slated to happen, I think, in mid-February-ish. Mm-hmm. I don't think there was an exact date, but that was what they were working towards. And when they filed, they had, and the exact number, we won't get into, but roughly 60 to 65% of support. Okay. They had a majority, right? Like a pretty strong majority. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of different reasons, they lost that support. There's a lot of things that we probably shouldn't get into. But the reality is the support was lost. And so what they looked at for themselves was, okay, do we want to fight through this and try and win an election that maybe we won't win, or make it a symbolic victory by just going to the election? That might have had some value. Mm-hmm. They ultimately listened to everyone in the bargaining unit that had changed their minds and said, can we pull the petition? Can we try and have these conversations in a different way? And decided to do that. And, I think there's a lot of other reasons, mental health and various different things, that they decided to make that choice. And ultimately we supported them, right? Like we, as the machinists, and I wasn't as involved in that process for a lot of different conflict of interest reasons. Sure. Right. It's one of those kind of funny things of like, oh, the third party telling you what to do. And we were like, okay, well, if that's what you guys think is the best choice, then we support that. Right.
But I think we do need to say that there was a strong anti-union campaign, sure, from the management side. And it's unbalanced when it comes down to that. So right. I do want to clarify that, because it's not alone that people will just change their minds from one day to the other. Right. It was a very strong campaign. Right. So with outside help, and they actually hired third party help. So
I know you guys know more about this than we do, and you wouldn't want to say any names, but how close are we to the first office being unionized?
Can we celebrate soon?
When is the...
that's so exciting that you guys want to celebrate.
Just let us know where to send the champagne.
I would say make sure you have champagne in the freezer or the fridge, right? Ready to go. Maybe not the freezer. Not the freezer. Well, the freezer would be that. Okay. The freezer, not yet. But definitely the fridge ready to go. Look, I think we're close. And we sort of mentioned this at the start, but we're talking with like 8 groups that are really active right now, and a couple of others that are thinking about it or have kind of like retreated at times. Mm-hmm. and kind of crop up again, but like 8 that are really active, some of which started after, or most of them started after the New York Times article, right? So mm-hmm. if the SHOP effort started in fall of 2020 and didn't go public until late 2021, almost the end of the year, mm-hmm. That's sometimes what it takes. Now that we have precedent, it can go shorter for some, and, mm-hmm. and smaller firms can move faster and things like that. But, mm-hmm. I think the reality is that a couple of them are really getting close. The other reality is that these timelines are really amorphous, and they shift quickly, for a lot of different reasons. And, even for us, when we were organizing, we hit a real plateau in the summer of 2021, right? Like after vaccinations vaccines became readily available. It was summer, especially in New York. It was this kind of like blossoming of things, right? Like, who wanted to have a conversation on Zoom about like how bad it was, like what you were trying to change about the industry? Like nobody wanted to have that conversation anymore. Right. So it was like, no, let's meet up in the park and only talk about nice things. Right. Yeah, so we plateaued, we were close, and then sort of like hit a wall for a while. And that happens too. And that's something that we talk with workers a lot about, is like, this is going to go in fits and starts. You might sort of jump really quickly to get, 10 or 15 people to sign on in a week. And then you might go a couple of months where like everyone's hesitant. Nobody wants to kind of sign on. The conversations are more difficult. And that really is just part of the process, and everyone is different.
And to that point, it just reminded me, the fact that, in architecture firms, especially larger firms with big names, like, there's a constant flow of workers. Like, there's such a fast turnaround that I've seen that with, like, maybe we start an organizing committee with a few people, and then like it becomes a whole different group, at a certain point. So because that's always changing, that also slows down the process. And it's also like a tool, right, that a lot of employers will use to their benefit to kind of like deflate any type of organizing that may happen.
Right. But it's all anonymous, right? I mean, they see the numbers potentially, but it's not like, you're wearing a red shirt. I know that you are.
You're part of the resistance.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
If you want to wear the shirt and the button and the hat, you could. Or go on the New York Times article.
The easy answer is yes. It is anonymous. And I think that possibility is important to the process too, especially for workers that are more precarious than others, right? Like people on visas, for instance, right? Like that is your legal status is tied to your employment, right? So that's a different level that we're talking about. But I think the point that I'd love to make about this is union activity and union kind of membership and participation is not passive, like, period. And I think that's a really critical part of the process, to sort of understand that in order to be successful, you have to be active. And, that can be at lots of different levels. And there's a sort of gradient of things here that you can kind of participate in. But like being public with support in some way, shape, or form. And that can be as simple as like, a kind of group action of like, we're all going to wear a shirt, right? Or we're all going to wear a button or a pin or something like that. That can be as public as we're all going to, comment on this Twitter thread and use our actual, Twitter accounts, or we're all going to kind of like do a march that's not against the boss, but is about the positives of this thing. Like, so it ranges between those poles, but kind of being upfront about the way these things are successful are not when a majority of the workers are fully anonymous. They're successful when a majority of the workers are actually speaking about this proudly. And a great example is the Condé Nast Union that went public earlier this year, a couple months ago. They put out a video like in their announcement that was 73 people, and they had a unit of about 400. They had 73 people, and they did it as like 73 reasons or 72 reasons, whatever it was. And each person gave their reason as to why they were joining the union. And again, that's not everybody in the projected bargaining unit, but that's a huge amount of people, right? And that had a big impact, both in terms of the public, but I think also in terms of their bargaining unit, to say, these people have come forward and put themselves out there for all of our benefit. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so for people who are interested in forming a union and they want to do something, but they have more questions, right? Who can they reach out to? How can they do that? Where do they go?
Sure. I mean, I think obviously I can give you my contact information directly, and, feel free to share that. But like I think the bigger point is, reaching out to the social media accounts, directly, emailing, the group, because that's not just the machinists, right? That's a group of workers that is interested in these things and can kind of talk you through what the steps are and like what the information might be. They might be able to answer some questions that lead you to decide that you don't want to do it, right? And I think that needs to be part of the process too, where it's like, okay, if you don't want to do it, but you wanted to find out that this information, that's okay. But also, the architecture lobby, I think, is an amazing resource. I think Labor Notes is an incredible resource, and that's a general kind of labor movement one. I think, again, writers like Noam Scheiber and Stephen Greenhouse and Lauren K. Gurley and a lot of other people that are doing amazing work on the journalism side are great places to kind of just like learn stuff. And I don't know, I mean, like on Twitter, like most union organizers are pretty open about what they're doing, right? And like who they are. And so again, that's sort of a plug for the labor movement in general, that like all the other unions, OPEIU, SEIU, UAW, like CWA, like all of these different places have active organizers in your kind of area. And whoever you feel comfortable reaching out to for that first conversation. And it might literally be like, oh, you're architecture workers, like you should talk to these people that have been doing a lot of work on that already. And that's helpful too. And I would probably do the same thing if somebody reached out to me, like a graduate student, right? For instance, reached out to me, I'd be like, you know what, we're not organizing grad students right now, but like communication workers are doing a lot of work on that right now.
Gotcha.
And kind of those word of mouth referrals are just as important.
Well, in the description of the episode, we will put the contact information of AWU and all that stuff. And we will actually do it this time, unlike all the hundreds of times I promised and I don't do it.
Yeah, right. But my last, not really question, but kind of thought is that we've been talking about unions mostly in basically reaction to something that is wrong in the workplace, workforce, right? Yeah. But let's say... And I'm just thinking about, past guests that we've had on that have maybe younger practices in architecture, landscape architecture, and why not, that are very much focusing in trying to do and develop a practice that is, just, equitable, resilient, and just really like doing good, right?
Yeah.
Would for them having a union be a way to maybe preserve that in the way that they might grow and have a tendency to kind of lose all of these big missions that are really at heart when they started the practice?
Absolutely. And I think it comes back to our point of this is about rights. Ultimately, right? And it's not about tearing an industry down or an individual firm down or an academy down or whatever it might be. It's about workers having access to rights to give them protections so that they can do the work that they like to do, right? And I think your example of like young firm owners that really want to do good work that is equitable, that is just for their employees, just as it is for their clients, this is a great option. And, I think it's a way of kind of establishing a clear and honest and open relationship between employer and employee that literally has everything spelled out, right? And and if you think about it in another way, it's like, what client would you really work with that you didn't have a contract with, right? Like you want to establish all of those things. You might break all of it later, which is dumb, right? But like, as we talked about, but like you establish those things and you establish what the working procedures should look like. And there's reason for that, right? It benefits and protects both sides.
Yeah. And even if you're a small firm, like we talked about, like, let's say you're a small firm and you have 2 employees, why not sit down and really understand, what is the experience of being an employee in this firm? Is it truly equitable? How do we make it so if we're missing something? But having a conversation that's open and transparent and, in a way that allows the employees to feel, protected and not at risk of losing their employee if they truly voice how it is that they feel. Because a lot of times especially in these small firms, like there is that idea, that you're a family and, it's very tough to like voice your opinion because you don't want to, make anybody upset or disappointed, as they may see you as their, I don't know, their nephew or
yeah. You're stuck in that same room with each other all day.
Yeah, exactly. So allowing that conversation to be had, but also we're in a capitalist system. We are still in a business, and a business will allow people to be fired, and we still kind of carry that baggage with us when we go into our work spaces when we're employees. So when you're saying like you're unionized or you're trying to come up with a contract that's, open and negotiable, who wouldn't want to be part of that office, or, and how would that not be equal to equity? That's like the ultimate definition of what equity is. And now we're seeing like a trend of, people wanting more of their rights met. We're seeing like the Great Resignation. We're seeing people leaving and quitting their jobs because they're reflecting and seeing how unjust their working practices are. So we're a lot more aware of what we deserve as workers. So there's a trend there. So I'm envisioning that you, as a small firm, having a contract that was negotiated with your workers is just going to attract the right employees to your firm, and it's also going to retain that talent. And retaining talent equals money, right? Because you don't want to be constantly having to teach your employees on how to do a job the way that you like them to do. So it's all like a win-win, situation.
That's awesome. Andrew, Jennifer, this was remarkable. I had a feeling this was going to be a great conversation, and I was like, 2 hours is a long time. I'm like, we're going to blow past that.
I know, I can't believe it.
I know, it goes by quickly.
We could keep going. I could keep going. You guys actually have my son. I have to go.
Well, that's good, because we'll continue the conversation in the future for sure. That's guaranteed, I believe.
Well, and the landscape will continue to shift, right? And hopefully soon we'll have some more news to talk about.
And
we'd be happy to.
The next time it'll be champagne
right after this.
We'll start with that.
Right? We'll have part two. Part two
sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.